It was a perfect day when John Richards pulled up to his new home, a charming two-story house tucked away at the end of a quiet suburban street. The air was crisp, the kind of fresh breeze that made you want to take a deep breath and just enjoy the moment. Birds chirped from the branches of tall oak trees lining the roads, and the sun bathed the houses in soft golden light. This neighborhood felt like something out of a postcard. Neat lawns, perfectly trimmed hedges, and neighbors who waved at you as they passed by with their dogs or kids on bikes. John had spent weeks searching for the right place. After years of city living, he was finally ready to settle down somewhere peaceful, where the pace of life was slower, and the biggest concern was deciding which local coffee shop had the best pastries. He had done his homework on the property, and everything seemed perfect. No signs of trouble, no red flags. He was moving into a house he believed to be free from the clutches of an HOA, an organization that John had grown to despise in the brief time he'd heard about it. As John unpacked the last of his boxes and arranged the furniture, he felt a wave of relief wash over him. The fresh coat of paint on the walls, the pristine backyard with just enough space for a garden, and the small but cozy front porch where he could sip his morning coffee. It was all his. The idea of having control over his own property without someone telling him what to do or what not to do was liberating. No more HOA rules, no more parking tickets for trimming his grass a little too short. He hadn't received any letters or notices about an HOA in the welcome packet, which he took as a good sign. Little did he know that peaceful tranquility was about to be shattered. In the days to come, John would discover that the picturesque neighborhood had a dark side, a side he never imagined. As he kicked back on the couch, content with his decision, the faint sound of a lawnmower in the distance seemed like a gentle lullaby. What John didn't realize was that he was about to be thrust into a battle that would test his patience, his nerve, and his understanding of what it meant to truly own a home. Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. All right, let's keep going. It had only been a week since John moved into his new home, and so far everything was as peaceful as he'd hoped. He'd settled into a routine, enjoying the calm mornings and quiet evenings. He had yet to meet many neighbors, just the occasional wave as people walked by, but that was fine with him. He liked his privacy, but one Saturday morning, that peace was abruptly interrupted. John was out in the front yard, enjoying the early spring sunshine as he trimmed the edges of his lawn. It was nothing excessive, just a little tidy up around the flower beds, some light work to make sure things looked nice without getting too manicured. As he knelt down to pull a stubborn weed, a figure appeared in the distance. A woman, tall, and wearing a visor that looked a little too large for her head, was walking briskly up the sidewalk toward him. John straightened up, wiping his brow and offering a friendly smile. "Morning," he called, hoping to strike up a casual chat. The woman didn't smile back. Instead, she stopped in front of him and fixed him with a stare that was almost clinical. She wore a tight expression, as if she'd just smelled something unpleasant, and it was clear she wasn't here for small talk. "You're John Richards, right?" she asked, her voice flat, as though she were reading from a script. "That's me," John replied, a little confused by her tone. "Is there something I can do for you?" "I'm Karen Williams," she said, nodding stiffly, "president of the Willowbrook Homeowners Association. I'm here to inform you that you're in violation of several community guidelines." John blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" She reached into her bag and pulled out a clipboard, flipping it open with an air of authority. "First, your lawn needs to be cut to exactly 2.5 inches. Secondly, your hedge trimmings should be disposed of by 7 p.m. on the day they're cut. Those are the rules." Karen paused, glancing down at the yard as though expecting a glaring violation to pop out at her. John looked around, bewildered. "I haven't received anything about an HOA, and I didn't see any guidelines when I moved in. Are you sure?" "Oh, we don't always send out the official notice right away," Karen said, dismissing his concern with a wave. "But you should have checked the website. You're also supposed to register your property with us, and clearly you've neglected that." John's head was spinning. He had no idea what she was talking about. "Wait a minute. I'm not part of any HOA," he said, a small laugh escaping his lips. "I made sure to check that before I bought the house." Karen's smile turned tight. "Well, that's something you'll have to sort out with the board. But for now, you need to address these issues, or we'll be forced to take further action." John stared at her, trying to process the absurdity of the situation. "So what's next? Am I supposed to pay a fine for trimming my hedges too early?" He couldn't help the sarcasm in his voice. "Let's just say we'll be keeping an eye on you," Karen replied, her tone colder than the breeze. "And don't make the mistake of thinking we don't have ways of making sure everyone follows the rules." With that, she turned on her heel and marched back down the street, leaving John standing there with a mixture of confusion and irritation. As Karen's figure disappeared around the corner, John felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next few days were nothing short of bizarre. Karen's visit was only the beginning. At first, John thought it was some kind of misunderstanding, maybe a simple mix-up. But by Monday morning, the HOA was back in full force, and it quickly became clear they weren't going to let up. It started with a letter, a neatly typed, formal-looking notice that arrived in his mailbox. The paper was crisp, almost too crisp, like they were making a point. "Notice of violation," the header read in bold black letters. John almost laughed when he saw it, but that quickly faded when he read the contents. Apparently his mailbox was the wrong color. It didn't comply with the approved color palette for the neighborhood. Then there was the matter of his driveway. Too wide, they said, even though it was the same size as every other driveway on the block. Oh, and his lawn. It wasn't green enough by HOA standards. Yes, according to them, his lawn was not up to snuff. John had always thought grass was supposed to be green, but apparently there were shades of green that were HOA approved, and his wasn't one of them. But the real kicker came 2 days later. He woke up to find a bright orange sticker on his front door, stapled on with military precision. "Violation of community guidelines. Immediate action required." The note demanded that John attend a board meeting in person to discuss his infractions, with the clear implication that if he didn't show up, things would only escalate further. It felt like a bad joke. Was this really happening? John couldn't take it anymore. He called the number on the bottom of the notice, hoping for some rational explanation, but instead, he was greeted by the voice of a woman with the same condescending tone as Karen. "Good afternoon, Willowbrook HOA," the voice chirped. "How can I help you with your violation today?" "I'm not a member of the HOA," John said, his voice strained with frustration. "I'm not even sure I'm supposed to be getting these notices. I didn't sign up for any of this." The woman on the other end didn't miss a beat. "Oh, well, that's a little inconvenient for you, isn't it? I'll have Karen call you back to discuss this further." "Karen?" John's patience was thinning. "This is absurd. You're trying to fine me for things that don't even make sense. I'm not part of your association." "Like I said," the woman replied, smoothly, "Karen will be in touch. Have a nice day." The call ended abruptly, and John was left staring at the phone in disbelief. He couldn't understand it. How had a simple misunderstanding escalated into what felt like a personal vendetta? This wasn't just about rules anymore. It was about control. And Karen, along with the HOA, seemed intent on reminding him of that at every turn. John knew one thing for sure. This wasn't going to be over until he stood his ground. The HOA was playing dirty, and he was about to find out just how far they were willing to go. John had never imagined that a peaceful suburban neighborhood could turn into a battleground. But there he was, standing at the edge of his front yard, staring down a police car that had just rolled up to his driveway. The flashing lights and the officer's stern expression only added to the absurdity of the situation. How did it get to this? It all started that morning when, as usual, John was enjoying his coffee on the porch. The sun was just starting to climb, casting long shadows across the lawn. He hadn't even gotten halfway through his first cup when he heard the unmistakable screech of tires. He glanced up expecting to see a neighbor in a rush, but instead the police car pulled into his driveway. The officer stepped out with a frown, looking more like someone who had just received bad news than someone on duty. "Mr. Richards?" the officer called, as if he were expecting him. "That's me," John said, standing up confused. "Can I help you?" "I'm Officer Daniels," the man replied, his tone flat. "We've received a complaint that you're trespassing on your own property." John blinked. "Trespassing? What are you talking about? This is my house." The officer nodded slowly, as if John's words didn't quite match what was in the report. "According to the complaint, you've been violating several community guidelines and ignoring HOA rules. Apparently, you've been refusing to comply, with several warnings." John felt the weight of the words sink in, and for a second he thought he might pass out from the absurdity of it all. "I'm not even part of the HOA!" he shouted, frustration bubbling to the surface. "How can I be trespassing on my own property?" The officer didn't respond immediately, instead pulling out a piece of paper from his clipboard and glancing at it. "It's all here in the report," he said, clearly reading from the same list of so-called violations that John had received earlier. "There's a specific set of rules you're supposed to follow as part of this neighborhood. If you don't address these issues, the HOA wants you to vacate the premises." John's jaw dropped. "Vacate my own house? Are you kidding? Me?" "Well, I don't make the rules, Mr. Richards," Officer Daniels said, his voice becoming more professional but equally as confusing. "I'm just here to enforce them." John shook his head in disbelief. This couldn't be real. But the officer's presence made it clear that somehow the situation had crossed the line from ridiculous to dangerous. The calm of the neighborhood was gone, replaced by the unsettling reality that an HOA, with its petty power games, had turned a simple dispute into something far worse. As the officer stood there, still holding the report, John's mind raced. Who was pulling the strings? Behind this? It wasn't just the HOA anymore. It felt like something much bigger, something much more personal. The anger boiled inside him, but he knew this was far from over. The HOA had just escalated things, and now it was time for him to fight back. John sat at his kitchen table, the last of the morning light filtering through the window as he stared at the papers scattered before him. His mind was a whirlwind of disbelief, frustration, and a gnawing sense of betrayal. After the police had left, the situation had only grown more bizarre, but it was time to get to the bottom of this. No more pretending that the HOA had the upper hand. He wasn't going to let them win by confusing him. John had spent the better part of the afternoon going through every document related to the house. Contracts, disclosures, even the neighborhood's property listing. He pulled up the official HOA membership details online, reading through the fine print like a detective chasing a lead. The more he dug, the clearer it became. He wasn't a member of the HOA. Not by a long shot. The discovery hit him like a ton of bricks. All this time he had assumed that some sort of bureaucratic error was to blame. But no, the truth was far more insidious. John was not, in any way, shape, or form, obligated to follow the HOA's rules. In fact, he had never signed a membership agreement or any document binding him to their so-called guidelines. He leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of the realization settle in. The HOA had no right to impose their rules on him. No right to demand fines. No right to send police to his doorstep. They were trying to enforce their arbitrary guidelines on someone who wasn't even part of their association. It was like a bully trying to tell someone they couldn't play in the sandbox. Except this bully had the audacity to call in the principal to enforce the rules. But the more John thought about it, the more something else clicked. The HOA's actions weren't just misguided, they were illegal. The rules they were trying to enforce weren't valid on a non-member's property. In fact, this whole thing felt like an elaborate power trip. Karen, the HOA president, wielding her self-appointed authority over a neighborhood that had no idea what was going on behind the scenes. John couldn't help but laugh bitterly at how he had been swept up in it all. The idea that Karen and her group had been so brazenly trying to control him, someone who was never even part of their little club, was infuriating, but also oddly empowering. He wasn't the problem here. They were. It was time to take this fight to them, head on. And this time, he wasn't backing down. John's heart pounded in his chest as he walked toward the HOA office, the papers he had gathered clenched tightly in his hand. The air felt thick with tension, and it seemed like the whole neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. It was time to confront Karen and the HOA, time to set the record straight. The office was tucked into a corner of the small community center, a nondescript building with peeling paint and an overgrown lawn. John had never paid much attention to it before, but today it felt like the center of a storm. As he stepped inside, the faint smell of stale coffee and printer ink hit him. A couple of folding chairs were scattered around a chipped table, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. It looked more like a forgotten storage room than a place of power, and John couldn't help but wonder how much of the HOA's so-called authority was built on nothing more than a flimsy stack of paperwork and Karen's domineering personality. At the table sat Karen, her arms crossed and a smug smile on her face. Her usual air of superiority was evident as she glanced up from her clipboard, clearly expecting John to back down. The officer who had visited his house earlier was standing beside her, his posture stiff, as if ready to back her up no matter. What happened? Well, Karen said, her voice dripping with condescension. I was wondering when you'd finally show up. I assume you're here to beg for mercy and apologize for your behavior? John didn't flinch. He placed the stack of papers down on the table, letting the sound of the heavy documents hitting the wood echo through the room. Actually, I'm here to set the record straight, he said, his voice steady but filled with undeniable resolve. Karen raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued, but not quite ready to show concern. Set the record straight? About what, exactly? John leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. You see, Karen, I'm not a member of the HOA. Never have been. And as such, none of your so-called rules apply to me. I've spent the last few days digging through the documents, and I can assure you there's no record of me ever signing up for your little club. The room went silent for a moment. Karen's smile faltered just for a second, but it was enough for John to see that she wasn't as untouchable as she liked to think. What are you talking about? Karen finally stammered, her voice no longer as confident. She quickly glanced at the officer, who stood silently by, his expression unreadable. Of course you're a member. Everyone in this neighborhood is a member. It's part of the neighborhood's legal agreement. John shook his head slowly. No, that's not how this works. I've never signed any contract with the HOA, and I've been legally informed that your actions have been illegal. I'm not bound by your rules. And you know what? You don't have the right to enforce them on me or anyone else in this neighborhood. The officer shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught between his duty and the unfolding revelation. Karen's face turned a shade paler as she scrambled to regain control of the situation. This is absurd, she said, her voice now shaky. You must have misunderstood. There's been a mistake. I'll get everything straightened out. But John wasn't done yet. He stood tall, his voice firm. You've been harassing me, sending police to my door and trying to enforce rules you have no authority over. I've got proof, and I'm not backing down. Karen's attempt to backpedal only made the situation worse. Her words stumbled over each other, her confidence evaporating like smoke. The damage had been done. The HOA's attempts to bully him into submission had unraveled, and now all she could do was try to save face. The officer, who had been quiet up until now, cleared his throat. "If what Mr. Richards says is true, then I'll have to advise you to stop all further actions immediately," he said, his tone more cautious than authoritative. "Enforcing HOA rules on non-members is outside my jurisdiction, and if you continue to do so, we'll have to reconsider how to handle the situation." Karen's face twisted with a mix of frustration and embarrassment. She opened her mouth to protest but then stopped, realizing there was no way out. The truth was out, and she had nowhere to hide. John had fought back, not with anger, but with cold, undeniable facts. For the first time, John felt the weight of the power shift in his favor. The HOA wasn't invincible, and as Karen stood there, speechless and defeated, he couldn't help but feel a small, victorious smile tug at the corners of his lips. The battle wasn't over, but this was a win. And for now, that was enough. The victory in the HOA office had given John a rush of adrenaline, but as the days passed, he realized the fight wasn't over. While Karen's bluster had been silenced, the situation still left a bitter taste in his mouth. The harassment, the police involvement, the absurdity of it all. It wasn't just going to vanish. John wasn't someone who simply walked away from a battle, especially when the stakes were this high. It was time to make sure the HOA faced the consequences for their unlawful actions. John did some digging, consulting with a few trusted friends who had experience with legal matters. What he uncovered was a clear path forward. A lawsuit. The HOA had no legal standing to enforce their rules on him, and they had knowingly and deliberately overstepped their bounds. His rights had been violated, and he wasn't about to let them get away with it. Armed with legal counsel, John filed a formal complaint, outlining every instance of harassment and unlawful action the HOA had taken against him. He wasn't just asking for an apology, he was demanding accountability. His lawyer crafted a solid case, pointing out how the HOA had misrepresented their authority and, in some cases, attempted to intimidate him into compliance. The moment John walked into the courthouse, a calm confidence settled over him. The whole ordeal had been frustrating, but now it felt like the final piece was falling into place. The HOA wasn't some untouchable force. They were just people, and people could make mistakes, or worse, break the law. The legal process was slower than he had hoped, but it was moving. One by one, Karen and the other HOA board members were subpoenaed, forced to answer for their actions. And when it became clear that John wasn't backing down, their tune began to change. The once dominant HOA started to crumble, pressured by the weight of their own mistakes. In the end, the HOA reached a settlement, agreeing to pay a hefty fine and revise their policies to prevent future abuses. John's victory was more than just a personal win. It was a statement that people couldn't be bullied into submission, not when they knew their rights. As he watched Karen leave the courthouse, head bowed in defeat, John couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The consequences had arrived, and they had hit where it hurt the most. John stood in his front yard, watching as the final remnants of the HOA's influence slowly disappeared. The neighborhood, once tense and on edge, had returned to its quiet, peaceful state. The only sound was the gentle rustling of leaves in the trees, a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded over the past few months. For the first time in a long while, John could breathe easy. The HOA's defeat was a sight to behold. The fine they had been forced to pay was substantial, and the public reprimands they had received during the settlement process made it clear that their reputation in the neighborhood was shattered. Karen, the HOA president, had been forced to step down after the lawsuit, and the other board members had been given a stern warning about their overreach. The neighborhood, which had once whispered in fear of their authority, was now free from their control. John chuckled to himself as he thought back to the absurdity of it all. The idea that he had been dragged through this mess over something as trivial as HOA rules was almost laughable now. He had been a simple homeowner, living in his own house, and yet he had found himself in a battle against a self-appointed army of bureaucrats who thought they could control every aspect of his life. It felt like something out of a bad movie, a plot twist no one saw coming. And then there were the police. It had been hard for John to swallow the fact that officers had been involved in something so ridiculous, but he had learned a valuable lesson in the process. Sometimes people with authority can be just as easily manipulated as anyone else. The officers who had shown up at his door, acting on false information, had since apologized, acknowledging the misunderstanding. The apology wasn't much, but it felt like a small victory in itself. They had been part of the system that had initially been used to intimidate him, but now they understood the truth. As John stood there, his gaze drifting over his property, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. The whole ordeal had started with confusion and frustration, but now it was over, and he had come out on top. The lessons were clear. Never underestimate the power of knowledge, and never let anyone, no matter how much authority they think they have, push you around. The absurdity of it all wasn't lost on him. He had spent weeks dealing with a bunch of self-appointed enforcers of rules that didn't even apply to him. But in the end, it was his refusal to back down. His determination to get to the truth that had won the day. He had taken a stand, not just for himself, but for anyone else who might find themselves in a similar situation. John let out a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past months lift off his shoulders. He was no longer the victim. The sweet victory was his. And as he turned to head back into his house, a small grin tugged at the corners of his mouth. It was over. And in the end, he had come out the victor. If you enjoyed this video and want to see the next part, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated. See you in the next one. Your support means the world.